Hello everyone, I'm Nuuk, and I make Pokemon sprites. I'm most well known on Twitter for making Gen 2 versions of Hoenn Pokemon, and for the game Pokemon Coral. I decided to make this video as I've been seeing many people making similar mistakes when spriting in Gen 2 style, and it seems like many people were interested in my process. So in this video, I'll be going over how I make and animate my sprites. I'll be going over the programs I use, my thought process, how I sketch, animate, etc. Now, of course, you can make sprites any way that you want. This video is specifically on how to make sprites that match the style of Game Freak sprites in Gen 2. Setup. Personally, I use the program Sprite. It is specifically geared towards pixel art and animation. It has layers, frames, can export sprite sheets, and is all around very easy to use. You can, of course, use any program you're comfortable with, though I would really recommend Sprite, especially if you're doing animations. This tutorial will use Sprite, however, many tips and tricks are usable across all programs. I just won't exactly know what tools or settings to use for your program of choice. Here are my preferences. You can reach this by going to Edit, Preferences. First thing is change the screen scaling to 100% so everything stops being so close up. Here are my cursor settings. I can't remember what the default is, but I recall it being different. Lastly, we're going to want to click Grid and change it to 16 by 16. This will give you squares the same size as tiles in Pokemon, so we'll be able to see how the game will load the sprite. This is really only important if you are animating, but it is extremely helpful for reasons we'll get into later. My palette is from all the regular and shiny forms of the Pokemon sprites in the Crystal version. You can get the same by opening up the Sprite Sheets linked in the description, clicking the menu icon here, and selecting Make Palette from Sprite. From there, you can click Save Palette as Default, and this will make it load this palette every time you start a new sprite, which is very helpful. First things to think about before beginning. Get as many references as you can of your Pokemon. The TCG especially is helpful for posing ideas. You will want to also be thinking about how you will be animating your sprite at this time, as otherwise you could back yourself into a corner later regarding movement. Going to image search and selecting GIF only will help you get an idea of how the Pokemon moves. If your Pokemon is from Generation 4 or below, I highly recommend trying to find a video of it in Pokemon Battle Revolution, as that is from back when Pokemon animations were less stiff. I would also recommend listening to a Pokemon's cry and try to visualize how the creature would make that sound. If you are making your own Pokemon, making a cry beforehand may be helpful. Additionally, thinking about how your Pokemon moves will create a more believable monster. Next, you want to think about the size of your canvas. First stage mons or smaller single stage mons are 40 by 40. Examples include the starters, Shuckle, and Mew. Larger first stage, second stage, and most single stage mons are 48 by 48. Examples include Farfetch'd, Drowsy, and Flaffy. The largest mons are 56 by 56. For example, Girafarig, Legendaries, and most final evolutions. You will want to look at Pokemon that have a similar size and body type as the Pokemon you're going to be spriting. If you want to match the original Game Freak style, you're going to want to make them similarly sized so that your sprites don't look huge or tiny by comparison. It's a common rookie mistake to want to make a sprite as big as possible, and I've fallen into it many times. Remember, you do not have to fill up the whole canvas. There are plenty of Pokemon that don't, like Sentret, Spinarak, and Oddish. Look at all this extra space in the canvas. The best way I have found to keep sprites similarly sized is using the ball method. What I do is open the Crystal Sprite Sheet, find a Pokemon that is similar, and scale up my brush to be about the size of the body part. I then go back to my canvas and make a new layer, and make a ball of that size. This will become the Pokemon's head. The Pokemon I am using for this tutorial is going to be Zangoose, which is pretty similar to Typhlosion, so we will be comparing sizes to him. At this point, you should have an idea for the pose and animation for the Pokemon you're spriting, so you should be able to place additional balls for the rest of the body. Make sure to be comparing sizing as you go. I always try to measure the other body parts in comparison to the head. Zangoose's body is about 2 times the size of its head, so that's how big we will make the body. It doesn't have to be exact either. You can always add or remove mass to fit better and as you sketch more of it out. Also, Keep in mind that Gen 2 has a more condensed look, with some parts being more emphasized, such as heads. However, newer generation Pokémon are becoming more bobble-headed, so I generally make their body sizes a little more proportionate. A good rule of thumb is that if there is an area with a lot of details, and it's starting to look squished, make that area slightly larger, or abstract some of the details to make it look not so busy. So for this sprite, I'm thinking of having his arm raised partially up for the neutral pose, and his body sort of lunging forward. While it's good to have a dynamic pose, you need to keep in mind that this sprite is mostly supposed to be the static pose you'll always see the Pokémon in. If you make the pose too dynamic, it will be difficult to make an animation from it. Something else I like to do is make sure you can see at least most of the Pokémon's details. For example, on my Lopunny sprite, I have the ears specifically positioned so they aren't covering most of the body. You can also see this with the placement of the wings on my Noivern sprite. So now that we have all the prep work done, I'm going to time-lapse my sketch. See you when we get to the line art. I'm always told my way of sketching is pretty unique, but this really helps me visualize sizes and see the Pokémon in a more 3D space. I recommend trying to keep each piece of the Pokémon on its own layer to help with animating, but even if you aren't animating, this can help with small adjustments later. This is similar to how Gen 5 sprites are animated. Let's do the line art really quick. Now that we've got the line art down, we can begin coloring. You probably already know this, but Pokémon on the Game Boy Color allowed for 4 colors: two of which were always black and white, with the other two remaining to color and shade your sprite. Before Crystal, if you played Pokemon on a Game Boy without color, it would show up as different shades instead of in color. You can see on this sprite sheet of gold and silver, the third sprite is in grayscale. For some, it may be easier to do your sprite entirely in shades of gray and add color later. This can help if you have a habit of shading too darkly. I personally start with color and then convert my sprite to grayscale later to make sure what I want my lighter color to be isn't too dark or close to my darker color. This also helps me make sure when my sprites are used, the build process will properly assign colors. Zangoose will be pretty easy to decide colors for, since it's mainly just red and white. I'm much more partial to the purple claws it was originally introduced with than the black claws it was given later. Unfortunately, we really can't leave that much of the body completely unshaded, and to match the purple of the claws would be way too dark. In cases like this, you'll have to do a bit of problem solving. What I'm going to do is have the lighter color be a grayish lighter purple, a rich red for the darker color, make the claws black, since they would be darker than the red, and highlight it with the lighter color with some red around the highlight, so it's not too stark of a contrast as well as make it look more glossy. For Pokemon that have more than 4 colors, you will probably have to change one or more colors to either white or black. Yellows typically turn to white, and any dark colors turn to black. You can see that here with Victreebel and Typhlosion. Notice how they are dithered in a way that makes them seem just like another shade instead of actually white or black. For those that don't know, dithering is when you mix 2 colors in a checkerboard-like pattern. Learning this technique allows you to make the most out of a limited palette. I'm very proud of this Toucannon sprite I made a while ago, and I think it really helps show the potential of using this technique. So, while I'm coloring this in, I'm going to talk about some things to avoid. Do not overshade your sprite. It's okay and very in style to not have a highlight and shadow on every color. In fact, most Pokemon only have highlights with no shadows. Here's what I mean by this. You can see here that normally if the Pokemon is mainly its lighter color, it will have a white highlight like Nidoqueen and Slowbro. If the Pokemon is mainly monotone, both of its colors will just be different shades of that color. Its body will mainly be the light color shaded with the darker color and have a very small highlight. You can see this on Electabuzz and Teddiursa. To highlight a darker color, you will typically use the lighter color, but not if the colors are very different, especially if they are close in shade. Pokemon that use this well are Spinrack, Octillery, and Sandslash. Lastly, for black, you will want to highlight with the darker color, which you can see on the Ghastly line, Murkrow, and Umbreon. I see this a lot with people newer to spriting for Gen 2, where the colors will be highlighted and shadowed with a whole lot of dithering. This gives you a very muddy-looking sprite, and it just looks very messy. Generally, in this style, you will find that less is more. This leads me to my next point. Do not over-dither. Dithering is a fantastic technique that works great for blending 2 colors. However, if you dither every highlight or shadow, it can also lead to a super messy sprite. Additionally, you want your dithering to have shape to it. There can be a lot of dithering without it looking messy, see Drowsy and Steelix. The dithering has shape, and it's also not surrounding every highlight or shadow. Keep in mind the shape of the object you are shading, and try to imagine how light would look hitting it. Additionally, it is generally best to avoid using black dither. It's just typically way too dark and makes your sprite look really dirty. You should only really use it in very tiny quantities, and only on the darker color. It works well for Poliwrath, but on Ursaring it isn't the best. And now, some things to keep in mind. Lighting for Gen 2, and I think all Pokemon games will come from the top left, so you're going to want to make sure you keep the light source consistent across the whole sprite. If something is being blocked by a horn, or a body part, it won't have a highlight on it, and may even need a shadow. For rounder shapes, you're going to want to use the darker color to anti-alias the outline, especially around the more jagged or angular areas. Smaller circles end up looking more like angled squares, so you're going to want to soften it if you're going for a more rounded shape. However, if your 2 colors are very different, or you're trying to anti-alias linear on your darker color, you'll likely want to take the inside color and make it bleed onto the jaggy. Using a very different color to anti-alias will look very strange, like this older Ralts sprite I did. You can see how the red in the linert makes it look messier. In these cases, you will want to anti-alias with the same color like so. In addition to anti-aliasing, you will also want to shade the outline on the highlighted areas. Generally, you will highlight the outline with the darker color near where the light source would be hitting the Pokemon. But if your two colors clash like mentioned before, you should use the same color as the inside. Now that the coloring is done, we can move on to the animation process. As mentioned before, you should have a pretty good idea about what your Pokemon will be doing for its animation by now. For Zangoose, the simple answer would be a quick slash down. However, since this is a tutorial, let's do something more challenging. I'm going to make it so that the first frame after the idle, or the one frame, has its arm down, and then we can animate a cool swipe up with motion blur. This is where a Sprite really shines in my opinion. You can add new frames and flip between them easily. It also has something called onion skin, which shows a faint version of your last frame, though I don't use it very often. Another nice feature a Sprite has is the ability to rotate a selection. This is also where layers come in really handy. As I mentioned before, it's best practice to put each piece of a Pokemon on a new layer so that it will be easier to isolate and animate later. If you didn't do this, it's not a big deal. You can simply copy your sprite in multiple layers and erase the parts that you don't need in that layer, though I'd also recommend filling in the parts that wouldn't be seen as well for consistency. For example, on my Zangoose sprite, I have the entire body drawn in, even the parts obscured by its arms. This helps make sure nothing is squished. It's similar to how you draw the entire head before adding hair, so the person you're drawing doesn't end up with a massive forehead. Additionally, it will help with animating, since things that were obscured before will be shown during the animation. Now, while rotating is useful, you shouldn't be overly reliant on it. To a trained eye, it's very obvious when an animation just consists of shifting parts around the canvas or just rotating limbs. This looks shoddy and is a lazy way to animate something. Don't be afraid of erasing a large part of your sprite and redrawing it. As you can see here, I erased Zangoose's entire arm and had to redraw it from scratch in order for it to look natural. There will be many times where this is necessary, and it will always look better than just shifting things around. For me, rotating is best used on your sketch. As you can see while I was doing the uppercut motion, I had to rotate the arm sketch a bit to make it look better. During the animation process, it will help out a lot to try and find as many references you can that are close to the poses you are doing. It doesn't even need to be the exact Pokemon you're doing. I've often used my own hands and arms to help see how something would look. Doing the motion yourself helps a lot in my opinion, as you can see what it looks like each step, as well as what would be the most natural way to draw that motion. When being accurate to Gen 2 style, you don't want to have too much motion. This is due to something called animation tiles. There is a wonderful explanation on what that is and how it works in the Poke Crystal GitHub linked below. Many projects have an increased animation tile limit. However, I always want my sprites to match vanilla, so I keep myself limited to the standard tile limit. This is also why I changed the background checkerboard pattern to be the size that it is, which I'll touch on at the very end. I do most of my work only on the layer I'm animating, with most other layers hidden. This is to help me focus just on that single part. However, you will want to show the other layers at some points to make sure nothing important is obscured by the new frame. You can see here that the arm was a little too high and it was covering the eye too much, so I moved it down since it looked odd. Additionally, you may have to add or remove shading in some spots due to the part moving, like I had to add a shadow under Zangoose's arm. For this animation, I will be adding what is called a motion blur. You can see this also in Sandslash and Golduck's animation, which is why I open them to use them for reference. This technique is rarely used, but it creates a very cool effect. It takes a lot of trial and error, as you need to create motion lines while not covering the part moving, but still being visible enough. Unfortunately, this is something you will have to eyeball, as there's not a one-size-fits-all method for this. The last part of the animation is to make the idle. If you look at a lot of Gen 2 sprites, you will notice at the end they mostly do a little blink or slight movement. Unfortunately, my footage for this part was corrupted, but you can see here my frames are separated at the 8th frame for the idle. Generally, idle animations are just blinking or a tail wag, something small. For Zangoose, I added a claw flex to make him look a bit more menacing. Once all your frames are done, you will have to change the timing for each frame. To do this, go down to your frames bar and double-click the number icon at the top. This will let you change how long the animation stays on this frame. Most people leave this at the default 100 for all frames, which makes the animation look weirdly stiff. Now that we have completed this animation, we can insert this into the game. I won't go too much into this, as it's not really related to making the sprite itself. I would really recommend doing this part though, as I always find myself finding small mistakes or things that look weird after I've inserted my sprites. I followed a tutorial on the Poca Crystal GitHub again for this, and I will link that down below. To get the files needed, you need to go to File, Export, Export Sprite Sheet, and select Vertical Strip and Merge Duplicates. Then, save this as a PNG file. After inserting, you should be able to see your sprite in the game. If you notice there are some white chunks missing, it is because your sprite is over the tile limit. Hopefully, you only have a few, otherwise it could mean you'll have to drastically change your animation. Luckily for me, Zangoose is only over by 2 tiles, which you can see at the very end of his animation. This is the reason we changed the background squares to 16x16. Whenever I run into this problem, I export my sprite as a GIF file and open it in Sprite. Change the occupancy of the layer to something where you can see the background. These are the tiles your sprite is broken into. From here, try to find some tiles where there is barely any change and just remove any changes. This will help save tile space on your sprite and hopefully get it working in game. For Zangoose, the frames that were over the limit are from his blinking. In this case, I will just reuse his scowl from earlier in the animation since there are already frames for that. With this change, he fully works in the game. And that's it. Thank you for watching this far. I hope you were able to learn something from this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. I highly recommend checking out the tutorials linked in the description. In addition to the ones mentioned in the video, Substitube also has a Gen 2 sprite tutorial that goes more in depth for some techniques that I glossed over, so I recommend checking that out as well. Lastly, if you enjoy what I do and want to support me, I've linked my Ko-fi down below as well. Thank you for watching.